Well, welcome back to Imperfect, the Heart-Centered Leadership Podcast. Oh my gosh, we are on the heels. Here we are, 2025. Super excited. I was just telling Scott, cut my hair off, felt like something new. And I was so intrigued when Scott wanted to be on the show because I think he has so much richness to share. And when you look at his bio below in the podcast episode description, you will see that. But it's my job as the podcast host to really show you his brilliance through some leadership questions that I have. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be with you. You're cutting your hair, and my hair is growing way too long. So,
Well, I was thinking about it's funny as we joke about things like this, but it's kind of like leadership, right? If you don't have new visions and are willing to change or willing to unlearn and relearn and grow, it's really easy for complacency to sneak in, right?
gotta experiment. Gotta try
I
anything.
thought it's only hair, right? It's only hair.
Looks great.
So I'm going to dig into some leadership questions that I have created for you based on your submission. So my first question is, I really see you, Scott, as someone who's deeply immersed in leadership development. And I would love for you to share with our listeners what has been the most transformative lesson that you've learned about leading with authenticity and heart.
So there is, and I'm going to geek out for a second if I can. Is that okay?
You geek out. It's the
Okay.
floor is yours.
Well, I love this intersection. There's this really cool branch of psychology called the adult development literature. And there's a gentleman at Harvard named Robert Keegan, another gentleman named Bill Torbert, who's done a lot of work in this space, had a very famous Harvard Business Review article. And, so these are theorists about adult development. And as you develop and grow as a human being, hopefully that's happening all throughout our lives. And that's through consistent and ongoing reflection. That is through dialogue with people of different perspectives, different experiences. I just got back from travel with my children, exposing them to different environments. There's a lot of different things we could kind of go into. What is it that helps someone learn, develop, and grow? Well, there's these stages in these theories. And if you have a person in a position of authority who's at one of these lower stages, where they're very centered on themselves, what they can get out of something, what they win, I win, you lose, black and white, this or that, right, wrong, very dualistic in their thinking. If you put a person in a position of authority and that's their literal mindset, that is their kind of their stage of mind, frame of mind, well, it can be pretty tragic.
Yeah.
And so according to Keegan, so that would be stage 2, where you have this person who's very focused on themselves and what they get. A person who is stage 3 has an ideology. It's called the socialized mind. And let's say you grew up in the United States in a Southern Baptist family in Tennessee that was Republican. Well, those were the waters you were swimming in, which are different than growing up in Ontario in a family that was apolitical and not religious. Well, it's totally different waters you were swimming in growing up. So that's called the socialized mind. It's just you were socialized into a worldview, and that's kind of what just was. Well, then you can, if you have an individual leading from this place, they can be very myopic in their world perspective if that is the only way they can view the world. So this is that person who thinks only Republicans are correct, only Latter-day Saints are correct, and everyone else is wrong. That's that socialized mind. And a stage 4 leader can kind of begin to see the complexities and see the nuances and see the differences and see the overlaps and see the tensions, the polarities in all of this that's going on. They can think a little more easily both and. So the mind of the leader matters greatly. It matters greatly. And the stage and the development of that leader matters greatly. Because if I'm a person who only cares about winning and getting what I want over you, Deb, it's going to be hard for me to access my heart.
Yeah.
I'm only concerned with what I get, how I win, you lose, I win. And, or if you have a leader who lacks maturity and doesn't create a place of psychological safety, well, then that can be incredibly tragic. Or a leader who has their worldview and that is the only worldview, and they shut themselves off from other perspectives. I'm not saying you have to agree with those other perspectives. I'm just saying, are you at least open to understanding and trying to understand that? Stephen Covey, seek first to understand, not to be understood, kind of worldview. So our maturity level matters greatly. And so I one quote that I just love, it was probably in my bio, who you are is how you lead. And that is your personality, that's your values, that's your lived history, that's your knowledge of leadership, but it's also your maturity level.
Mm.
And so are you kind of the best possible version of you if others are in your care? So, this whole intersection of adult development and leadership fascinates me because it matters. It matters.
This is why I wanted you on the show, because when I wrote the Heart-Centered Leadership Playbook, I wrote a subtitle, Mastering the Art of Heart in Life and Leadership. And you just beautifully unpacked the 4 stages of 4 totally different leaders. And when we look at a leader, and like you said, the experience, the level of maturity, the wisdom that they want
Yes.
to share.
Yep.
My mentor used to call it the WIFM. What's in it for me?
Yep.
The WIFM has to go. It's not a sales model. It's a people-centric model. And it's interesting to me how many leaders do not recognize stage 1, 2, and 3 that you so beautifully shared, and that their life does show up in their leadership every single day. So I love the perspective. You're speaking my language, and I love it. See what happens when you put us leadership geeks together? Spontaneous combustion. Okay, my second question is fun. It has permanent residency on the show.
Okay.
I've asked over 300 leaders around the globe this question.
Wow.
What imperfections does Scott bring to his heart-centered leadership?
Lenny.
So what's the top one? What's top of mind?
The imperfections that I bring to heart-centered leadership. Well, okay, I'll say it this way. So I've seen a psychologist for about 17 years. And there's this fascinating theory called social learning theory. Social learning theory means that we learn from our environment. So what is one of the most important stages of any human? Well, it could be home. It's our parents. In many ways, they're modeling, whether it's growth mindset, they're modeling healthy boundaries in relationships, they're modeling curiosity, they're modeling gratitude. All of that stuff is modeled for us in the kind of most foundational ways at home. And parents probably have the greatest levels of influence, right? I mean, maybe let's go 3 to 11 or 12 years old. That's not scientific by any stretch, but let's just kind of say, if you're modeling curiosity for your children when really you are the center of their universe, they're more likely to be curious.
Absolutely.
Right? So we all have these things that were learned along the way, whether it's kind of how we argue, how we engage in conflict, how we, again, problem solve, and kind of our mindset around problem solving. So parenting has been like just the most, it's a mirror, right? It's a mirror if we really, really, and so I think leadership is as well, because whatever your weakness is, it will be exposed. It will be. Bottom line.
Absolutely.
Because it's so multifaceted and what's required of us to be successful. Yeah, you have to be inspirational. You have to be great at building a team. You have to be curious. You have to create psychological safety. I mean, it's just go down the list of the dozens and dozens of things leaders have to be great at. And so, of course, there's going to be areas of improvement. So emotional intelligence is one for me, especially when it comes to parenting, right? This morning, I did not model effective emotional intelligence to the degree that I would want to. I just didn't.
That's
And
parenting.
Well, and it's I think it's leadership as well, right? So it's
Absolutely.
life.
Yeah.
And so I think for every one of us, we have these great strengths. Sometimes those strengths can become weaknesses and shadows. We also have areas of growth, each one of us. But one that I continue to come back to and that I'm ongoing, in an ongoing, consistent, always fashion, working to practice is emotional intelligence. I love the phrasing when it comes to leadership, a skillful intervention. That's how they say it at the Kansas Leadership Center. Are leaders skillfully intervening? Well, I'm getting better. I'm much better than I used to be. But am I skillfully intervening all of the time? No, because
None of us are. And that's the name of this show, imperfection, right? Like we do my Irish Nana, used to say you do what you can with what you have in the time that you have it, and that can change every 2 seconds.
yeah, yeah. And so it's, we just got off of, in so many ways, 90%, just a wonderful 5 days in California with family, Joshua Tree National Park in the US, just wonderful. And 10% of it is you're traveling with 5 other people, 7 other people in this instance. And so again, I view it as an opportunity to practice emotional intelligence. And there were some times on the trip where literally I practiced and I did well. There were a couple times on the trip where I didn't intervene skillfully. So
And that's okay. We're not, we're meant to model, but we're also human and
yeah,
not perfect. And they need to see that too.
yeah, 100%. And I'm getting better and we are getting better. And, because there's also that negotiation of us. So it's so fascinating, this whole kind of realm of thinking of family as an opportunity to not only develop your own leadership skills, but to model that for our kids. And then it's also a place where sometimes I'm modeling failure, where I'll circle back and say, hey, look, I didn't. That's not how I wanted that to come across. I apologize. This is what we need, and I failed in that instance. And so it's if you choose to take on the challenge, it's a wonderful learning opportunity. It is.
Well, and we all have to take time out to eat the humble pie, right?
Yes. Oh, 100%. Leadership as well.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
You know what? I join you in that. And again, we joked about it at the beginning, but if we don't acknowledge our own self awareness and do that self audit, I mean, that again is another opportunity for complacency. And
Yes.
if we're not learning and growing, we're not really living. And
Oh.
I think, things have changed over several decades from when you and I went to school and just even workplace culture. It's a different world, especially post COVID, which leads in nicely to my next question.
Well, can I say one thing, Deb?
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is so again back to the adult development thing. That's that imperial mind might just blame others. Well, they don't get it. And they can only literally see what
Yeah.
the other person did to trigger them. They can't take any ownership for themselves and their own behavior. So again, circling back to that topic, it matters greatly, right?
Absolutely. We have to take responsibility.
Hey,
My dad used to say there's 3 sides to a story. There's your side, there's my side, and then what really happened, which I always laughed at as a kid, right? Okay, in your work, how do you help leaders balance the demands of high performance with the need to stay emotionally grounded and connected to their teams?
Mm. Okay, so in the leadership literature, you have this kind of classic, we could call it a polarity, we could call it a dichotomy, we could call it a tension that is this task relationship, right? Am I focused on the tasks and the stuff and getting the stuff done? Or am I focused on the people and the relationships and that side of the work? And of course, as a leader, you're navigating that tension. And so it's called a polarity. And you have some leaders who just default into really focusing on the people, and maybe the task and the accountability and the difficult conversations falls down a little bit. And then you have individuals who are highly focused on just getting the results and the tasks accomplished, and the people are less of a priority. So this is a classic dichotomy or tension or polarity when it comes to leadership. And we all have some defaults. We all have some spaces where we feel a little more comfortable and where the work is a little bit easier. So I always, me personally, I fall on this kind of productivity, output, results side. I'm an ENTJ on the Myers-Briggs type indicator, right? Like I have a vision, let's logically lock it in and let's go, right? And, so from a heart-centered perspective, at times that was a huge learning for me, especially earlier in my career, because sometimes we need to shift gears. Sometimes we need to deprioritize some of the task and focus more in on the individual and that leader and that person, that human being. But boy, it came very naturally for me to drive toward the results. So I think that's just been a huge learning for me over the years is that balance. And again, it's not always going to be balanced.
Right.
But at times, I might need to turn up the dial on the empathy, turn up the dial on the relationship, turn up the dial on really prioritizing that versus just the output. Now, at times, I might have to turn up the dial on output. Turn
Absolutely.
up the dial.
It's a delicate balance. I was going to bring that up to you, but you've wove it in there.
Yeah.
And it has to be a delicate balance. And it doesn't mean that, you're perseverating on the vision or the task. You can do that eloquently with assertive leadership and heart-centered principles and still get the job done, but still be mindful that, like you said, sometimes the dial might have to go up on the empathy because you're managing people and they have lives and stuff happens.
Yep.
Emergencies don't come with a date, it's just kind of hard. It just doesn't. And being able to, I come from the medical world, and being able to have a beautiful, decent level of equanimity when you're anchored on that vision and those outcomes, and then something bad happens to one of your team and their family. I've seen the worst of the worst, but I've also seen a lot of the best.
Yes.
And the people that handle that really have that balance really well. And that's where you're readjusting the dials again to support that person. We're with you. We have your back. Let us know if you need anything. And you rally together and you get it done. And I've seen that done in several sectors. But you're right. It has to be the right person.
Yes, and intentionality is such a really important word here. That do I even have it on my radar? That I said to my daughter yesterday, we're working on coaching her through something, and I said I'm going to elevate kind of our focus on this, not to be mean, but because we know you're awesome and we know you can do it, and so there's intentionality there. I'm ahead of time saying, look, we're going to turn up the dial and holding you accountable for this because we know you can do it, but the dial's getting turned up. So again, in those moments, I'm like locked in on emotional intelligence. I'm not in the moment responding. I'm proactively setting the stage. But it's that intentionality behind how we're intervening. Again, am I skillfully intervening? And it's those leaders who don't even have that on their radar. Again, go back to the adult development thing. I think developmentally, their form of their mind can't even begin to conceive of it. Humans are just cogs in the wheel. Go, I'll get another one if you don't produce, right? You've worked for that person somewhere along the way. And that gets to be kind of tragic when someone stays in that space.
Well, and I made a promise to myself this year on the podcast that I drop some vulnerable moments because I don't do that.
Yeah.
I didn't have a great upbringing. I didn't have a dad. My dad passed away when I was 21. My mom suffered from alcoholism and mental health and all the things that didn't really have labels back then. But I had an Irish Nana who, embraced me and grounded me in a belief system and a value system and a faith system. And, she would say to me things, at 8 years old, like, not everyone's going to like what you say. Not everyone's going to like you, but you can always control you. And I hung on that. And like you know, I'm sure you've had trauma and loss in your family. There's not one person you meet who hasn't.
No.
But being able to have a therapist, and most of my C-suite leaders have a therapist and a coach because they serve different purposes. And that therapist is so invaluable because they help to define and break down and unpack those triggers from their life that's showing up in these moments that you've so eloquently talked about today. And it isn't a separation. And heart-centered leadership is smack in the middle of business acumen. I was told, in my 20s, it didn't have a place, but I knew it did. And it's been my life's work. And you can be a nice person, and you can be assertive, and you can be kind. So I love that you kind of shared that vulnerable moment. So you nudged me to do mine. So we're all just human beings doing the best we can.
Exactly. I think for me, what's wonderful in what you just said, yes, for 17 years, I've seen Dr. Phil, not the Dr. Phil, but he's my Dr. Phil, and he's awesome. And before that, I saw a gentleman for 5 years, and yes, we all carry forward. Let's go here for a second. So my parents were engaged in a 3-year divorce during high school, and kind of saw my family get affected by that. I had 2 significant breakups with girlfriends in high school and in college. So how's Scott do with trust? Well, that's an interesting puzzle right there, because you put Scott, who struggles with trust, at the stage 2 and developmentally into a position of authority as a leader, and adventures ensue. And so I think, yes, that who you are is how we lead. That's your lived history is part of who you are.
Absolutely.
And the good, bad, and ugly of that. And again, if others are in our care, are we the best possible versions of ourselves right now? And for me, the literally the master kind of lesson after almost 275 conversations on my side, let's see if you agree with this on your side, but it's that individual we're learning as a way of being, where personal development and personal growth is a way of being, that they're open to exploring their shadows, exploring their areas of growth. That's the winner in the long run for me. That's the master.
Agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And when we talk about that intersection of life showing up in your leadership,
Yeah.
that intrinsic value for kind of that person we're characterizing, there's triggers. And those triggers, if they're not navigated with compassion by the right person, it's a repetitive pattern of behavior in your leadership. And I can say, I'll join you in the plus 275 conversations. What it's causing present day is executive flight risk.
Mm.
And HR, I mean, they're throwing their hands up in the air. Like, why aren't people staying? Well, if you've got that top-down leadership approach that has seeped into your culture, which is now rich in toxicity, that's why. And nobody, it's not pointing or blaming, it's identifying and analyzing to say, have you thought about maybe giving George or Suzanne some coaching? Because at their level with that heavy intrinsic life stuff, I've had them say to me at that level, I don't need coaching. Do you know who I am? Just that whole, my worth and worthiness is on the initials after my name and all the extrinsic value. And do you know who I am?
Yep.
And my little heart just patters to think,
Yep.
I'm going to be joyful to help you. I'm a gift. This wasn't a punishment. It's a gift.
Yeah, and yes, I mean, you have what is it, Gallup's numbers of 2/3 of individuals are not engaged at work, or at times I'm in organizations where people are complaining about Gen Zs and they can't retain Gen Zs or recruit Gen Zs. Well, some of that is an interesting experiment. Some of that's data. Who are we putting in positions of authority? Are they skilled? Do they actually know what great leaders do? Or were they just the best salesperson or the best phlebotomist?
Yeah, right?
Because this is a totally new job now that we have asked them to. I'm a nurse. They have this totally new job. And guess what? Training them to do the Press-Ganey scores and the quality metrics and the P&L, that's not leadership. That's some of the stuff we have to do for the job.
Yeah.
But you've seen it. If you came up through healthcare, you promote the person into nurse manager or charge nurse. So we give them very few tools. And
Yes.
hope they can fix the culture in the ICU. And no wonder, right? So it's hard for us to sometimes look within and look at what we're putting into motion. And again, I think that elevated mind will be able to say what we're doing isn't working yet. What else do we need to be trying to do to increase market share, to increase the number of Gen Zs who want to work here, to better retain our nurses, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whatever the complex adaptive challenge you're working is, create a high functioning culture or team.
You've just said something that's led beautifully into my last question. So the scenario you just described, I've had many over the last 16 years. I call them accidental leaders. And the first session I get, why did they take me out of my lab and my data? Like, what did I do wrong? I don't want this team. I don't want to manage these people. Like, what did I do wrong? And I love when I say, somebody sees something in you and they're like, but what did I do? And they were just happy in their little introverted corner with their data and their spreadsheets or their lab and all, right? And so that's my last leadership question is, what advice would you give to an accidental leader to navigate really a moment of greatness for them that they're not seeing because they take it as a punishment?
Well, there should be some self-doubt. And again, sometimes we think of imposter syndrome as being bad. So much of your job, if you're a master carpenter and you know pine and maple like a champ, and you're really, really good at woodworking, but now you have a new job of getting work done through others, through and with others, a team. You're a foreman, let's say. Well, that's a totally new job. There are now things that are required of you that have never been required of you. So no wonder you feel like an imposter. No wonder you feel a little bit worried because you haven't been trained on how to negotiate, build a high functioning team, problem solve, influence others, hold people accountable, have difficult conversations. It's a long list. So my number one, now the good news is this. For a good number of those, you're locked in. You have skill in that area. It's just baked in. There's probably 3 or 4 things. Maybe it's emotional intelligence. When I do some work in construction, some of those individuals grew up, back to social learning theory, in an environment where I just yelled and screamed and barked. That's what they grew up with. I was in an automotive company about 8 months ago, and this gentleman said, Manuel, the leader in 1999, is not the same leader as 2023. It was 2024. And I said, good, because Manuel would be in HR and have lawsuits, right? So,
and consistent pips.
Yeah.
It's funny, but when I've heard similar nuances or descriptors, and even though they have an annual review and they're to be growing, it's always funny to hear that statement.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
So I think it comes back to, are you learning about leadership? Are you taking a certification course at your local university? Are you reading The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner? They've been researching the topic for 40 years. Are you learning about this new work as a way of being? Because there are some new things you're going to have to learn. It's like putting me, who's studied leadership for 20 years, into a job about carpentry. Of course, I have no idea where to even begin. I know what a 2x4 is, and that's about it. Well, that's what we're doing with leadership sometimes, right? I mean, you've seen it. We're doing the exact same thing, and it's actually really kind of asinine when you step back and think about it, because it's like asking me to do phlebotomy. Now, I'll learn it. I'm going to poke a lot of people and I'm going to hurt a lot of people in the process, right? Yeah. But it's just that's silly when you think about it sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think if you feel like an imposter, if you feel unprepared, if you feel a little disgruntled about this new role, are you listening to podcasts like this? Are you reading? Are you learning? And you can do it. It's no different than carpentry. This can be learned, this work, but there's going to be some things you're going to have to work on that don't come naturally to you. There's going to be some skills you have to develop. No different than there would have to be skills I'd have to develop if you put me into selling cars. I'd have to develop some skills.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move to my Fab Four. These are just 4 fun questions.
Okay.
We just want to know what's sitting on the top of mind, so don't think. Okay, first question. Give us one practical tip you want our listeners to walk away with today.
I want you to always be reading a book about leadership. Read 2 pages a day. Nothing more than that. Hold yourself accountable to 2 pages a day. That's a lot of pages in the course of a year. And if you do that over 10 years, you're going to learn leadership.
Love it. Second question. If your leadership style had a theme song, what would it be? Here's where I'm really going to get to know you now.
The first thing that came to mind was Inagata Davida, which is sung by Iron Butterfly with a big drum solo in the middle. So I'm going to stick with that.
You're showing your age. We align. All right. If you could summarize a lesson from our discussion today to leave with our listeners, what would be the lesson?
I'm going to go back to my favorite quote, who you are is how you lead. So who are you? It matters greatly to the people under your care.
Love it. Okay, I'm going to ask you to finish this sentence to close out the show. I'm a big believer in serendipity, and I'm glad you wanted to be on the podcast. And I do not think this is our last intellectual stimulating conversation, period.
Awesome.
All right, Scott J. Allen, finish this sentence. Heart-centered leadership is?
Intentional.